The evolution of belief, tracing the roots of monotheism. Once upon a time around 2200 BC, when ancient Sumeria was struggling against the Gut people, a resident of Ur named Terah gathered his servants, livestock, wives, his male children and their families, and set off to the west. Terah was not a Sumerian, but he was probably an Akkadian, or a member of a tribe related to him whose ancestors came from Shem, the biblical ancestor of the Semitic people. Terah, who was born during the reign of Naram-Sin, may have never experienced life in a Ur free from the threat of the Gutians. During his youth, Ur had taken advantage of the weakened power of the Akkadian kings to assert its independence from Akkadian rule. By the time he had become the father of 3 sons, the last Akkadian king had made a final effort to hold onto the throne. As his young family grew, the Gutians destroyed Agad and swept freely across the entire northern plain. As Utuigal moved towards Ur to seize it and then lost it to his son-in-law, Terah and his family decided that they would be better off leaving the city. They journeyed towards Canaan in the west, towards the Mediterranean coast, and away from the barbaric Gutians, the vengeful Elamites, and the ambitious Sumerians. Utuigal was an ancient king of the Sumerian city of Uruk who ruled from approximately 2119 to 2113 BCE. He is most famous for his Code of Laws, which is considered one of the earliest known legal codes in human history. The code, which is also known as the Laws of Ur-Nammu or the Sumerian Laws, is a set of legal principles and penalties that deal with issues such as theft, assault, and property disputes. The code was later updated and expanded by other rulers, including Hammurabi of Babylon. The theological explanation for the journey in Genesis 12 is that Abram heard the voice of God. It was not a Sumerian or Akkadian god, but the God who called himself by the enigmatic name or YHWH, possibly a form of the verb to be. This name consists of only 4 consonants. The Masoretic text of the Book of Genesis does not have vowels anywhere, as readers were expected to add them as they read. The vowel letters added to the Hebrew text were written much later to make its meaning standard. At that time, the name was pronounced as Yahweh. However, to prevent the disrespectful use of the name, many readers replaced it with the generic term Lord, Elohim, which since 1100 AD has been used by scribes unfamiliar with Hebrew to insert Elohim's vowels into the YHWH consonants, resulting in the nonsensical pronunciation Yahweh, which eventually made its way into English as Jehovah. His father Terah and his family were likely worshippers of the moon god Sin and his daughter Inanna. The name Terah itself reveals a blood relation to the moon god Sin. Sarai, Abram's wife, is also his half-sister, Terah's daughter from another wife. The name Sarai comes from the Akkadian version of Sin's wife, the goddess Ningal. The name Abram itself, which means exalted father, is ambiguous. It can be assumed that both names are related to the worship of the moon, in part because in the continuation of the story, YHWH renamed both of them as part of a covenant. The new names given, Abraham and Sarah, contain the new syllable Ah, the first syllable of YHWH's covenant name, a name that reclaims them from ownership of Ur and transfers ownership to the God of Genesis. From God, Abram received both a promise and a command. The promise was that he would be made into the father of a great nation and would be blessed. The command was for him to leave his country and his people in the city of Ur, where the population was a mixture of Akkadians, Sumerians, and other Semitic peoples, and to go to the land I will show you, the land of Canaan, almost straight to the west. Based on blood, Abram was no different from the Semitic people around him and not so different from the people who inhabited the land he was heading to. But based on divine command, he was separated from the others and began something new, one Semitic person among the others, one God emerging from the confusion of polytheism. He was the first monotheist. Instead of heading straight west, they went northwest, following the easier path along the Euphrates River, which eventually led them to the small city of Haran, where they settled. Haran was relatively peaceful and located on a busy trade route and, like Ur, was a center of moon worship and likely felt familiar. Back in the south, Ur-Nammu had taken the throne from his father-in-law and expanded his rule into a Neo-Sumerian empire, but his reach never extended as far as Haran. Around 2094 BCE he died after an 18-year reign, and his funeral poem praised him as a wise and trustworthy shepherd of the people, a king who had restored Sumer to its original state, and someone who was fit to share the throne in the afterlife with Gilgamesh himself. Ur-Nammu's son, Shulgi, succeeded his father. Soon after, perhaps 4 or 5 years later, Abram left Haran and resumed his journey towards the land that God had promised him. He headed south and eventually reached Shechem, west of the Jordan River and halfway between the two bodies of water that later became known as the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. There he asked God to reaffirm that the land would be his, because as far as he could see, it was all inhabited by Canaanites. Canaan is an anachronistic name for the land that in the first millennium BC was known as Israel or as Palestine to the Romans, and as the Levant to the Crusaders. In 2090 BC, there was no name for the land that God had promised to Abram because it had neither a racial nor a political identity. After a short time in Shechem, Abram was forced to go south to Egypt because a famine was in the land as stated in Genesis 12:10. Egypt at that time, which had relatively more water, was ruled by the 8th dynasty. This 8th dynasty had 27 kings over a span of 146 years and did not have any noteworthy kings. Then, in 2160, a powerful noble from Heracleopolis named Ptolemy succeeded in bringing all of Egypt under his rule. According to traditional dating, Abram arrived in Egypt with his wife, servants, and livestock around 2085 BC. This was not long after the time of Ptolemy III and the 10th dynasty, a pharaoh who wrote about West Semitic invaders. This hostility may have caused Abram to conceal his identity from the pharaoh, as recounted in the book of Genesis. After leaving Egypt, Abram returned to Canaan and settled near Hebron, some distance to the south of Shechem. The promise to become the father of a great nation initially seemed difficult to achieve, and Abram and Sarah tried to do it themselves by having Abram impregnate Sarah's maidservant Hagar, who gave birth to Ishmael, whom Sarah claimed as her own. This was not an unfamiliar practice in the cities of Sumer, and was regulated in a set of Sumerian laws known as the Nuzi Tablets. However, this practice did not apply to Abram. The promise of a new nation was not just to Abram, but to Abram and Sarah together. Like the one true God, the new nation would resemble what had come before but would be entirely different from it. The God of the book of Genesis shares characteristics with the nature-bound pantheons, but this God transcends nature and is not controlled by it. The new nation would be different from the surrounding nations because it was created by the promise of the one true God. This promise was repeated to Abram after the episode with Hagar, and his name was changed to Abraham, which indicated his divine ownership and that of his descendants. The first monotheistic religion emerged from Abraham, Sarah, and their descendants, which we know today as Judaism and Christianity. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more about man in history.